Late at night, I witnessed the murder from my window. I was so scared that I wanted to shrink my body, but the lights in the house suddenly came on. The murderer raised his head. Start counting from the floors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After counting to 5, he opened his mouth. Holding the bloody axe, he walked straight towards the corridor of my house. The lights dimmed again. The hairs on my body stood up instantly. The 8-year-old me screamed in extreme fear. But before I could make a sound from my throat, a pair of hands covered my mouth tightly from behind. I twisted and struggled. But I heard a familiar voice behind my ear. Shoo. Daughter, be quiet, he's coming. There were deliberately low footsteps coming from the corridor. My mother made a hush gesture to me. She tiptoed and locked the door. She started to call my father, but the call didn't go through. She had no choice but to call the police anxiously. Oh, is this 911? This is the Century Building. My daughter and I just saw someone killing someone downstairs. The murderer spotted us and was heading towards our house. 911 told my mom to stay calm and that they would be there in 10 minutes. My mom calmed down and pushed the sofa against the door. I wiped the tears from my face and used my small body to help my mom. My mother held the kitchen knife in one hand and hugged me with the other. Her back was completely wet. Don't be afraid, my daughter. Mom is here. We'll be safe once the police and Dad get here. My mother told me not to be afraid, but her voice was shaking. The door lock began to turn frantically. My mother called my father, but the call never went through. The murderer outside the door seemed to have lost his patience. All I heard was a bang. The murderer's axe directly cut through the door lock. Everything happened in a flash and the tall figure broke into the room. He overturned the sofa, kicked my mother away, picked up the axe and started smashing things. When my mother stopped moving, he walked towards me and chopped down with an axe. At this time, my unconscious mother opened her eyes, turned over and threw a kitchen knife at the man, injuring him. Shouting, "Daughter, my child." The murderer was so angry and hurt that he rushed towards my mother like a madman. 1, 2, 3. My mother kept holding the man's legs tightly. He didn't let go until he died. She was hit by 20 blows. There is no longer any human shape. The noise woke up many neighbors in the corridor and the lights in many houses were turned on. Police sirens could be heard from afar. The murderer escaped through the window. This escape lasted for 10 years. I saved my life, but the price was that I could never stand up again. After we were sent to the hospital, my dad finally came. When he saw my mom, he was devastated. He couldn't speak. Before I was sent to the operating room, I asked my father, who was still in a trance, through the red gauze. Dad, why didn't you answer my mom's call? If you had answered the phone, my mom wouldn't have died. But I don't know. Later, my words were like a spell, forever trapping my dad in the day my mom was murdered. His hair turned white overnight. He spent the whole day holding his phone and slapping himself in the face. Why didn't you answer the phone? Why didn't you answer the phone? It wasn't until I was discharged from the hospital that he finally came to his senses. But the first thing he did was to sell the taxi he relied on for a living. My father bought a motorcycle and strapped me, a disabled man, on its back. He printed countless photos of the murderer. He spent all his family wealth and offered a lot of money online to seek clues. Offline, he traveled across 50 states and 1,000 towns and villages. He pursued the murderer for his wife for 10 whole years. I also lived on his back for 10 years. But the last time, on July 10, 2020, he did not come back alive. And it was on this day that I was reborn. I was reborn on July 10, 2010. Before my mother was murdered. I opened my eyes and it was dark. The next second the lights came on. The man downstairs was looking up and counting the floors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After counting to 5, he smiled at me, holding the bloody axe, and walked straight to the corridor of my house. That horrible face, which I would never forget even if it was burned to ashes, made me shudder uncontrollably. The lights suddenly went out. My mother covered my mouth from behind and the cat stood up. Shoo. Daughter, be quiet, he's coming. I turned around and saw the beautiful face that haunted me in the moonlight. I hugged her uncontrollably, buried my head in her neck, and tears rolled down my cheeks. Mom. My mom got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and she saw me standing by the window looking down, so she turned on the light. If it weren't for me, none of this would have happened. I was the one who harmed her. My mother stroked my hair and said, "Silly daughter, don't be afraid. I will protect you." My mother acted quickly and called my father. But my father's phone was still the same as in the previous life. She quickly locked the door, called the police, and pushed the sofa to block the door. While she continued to call my father, she went to the kitchen to find a kitchen knife. But I knew that the murderer's strength was overwhelming for the 8-year-old me and my frail mother. The kitchen knife and the sofa are both useless. It only took a few minutes from going upstairs to killing someone and escaping. There was no way the police could get here so quickly. I was sweating all over. I couldn't let this tragedy happen again. But how can I save myself? Mom! Shout louder. The murderer killed in order to silence the witness. In my previous life, the murderer made so much noise in my house that many neighbors were woken up. They turned on the lights and fled immediately. This shows that what he fears most is being seen. At that time, cameras were not yet widely used. As long as no one saw me, I could escape. I started smashing things and making noises. I kept shouting, "Mom, shout with me. Help! Help!" My mother was shocked by me and jumped in anxiety. "Daughter, don't shout, don't shout. What if we invite that person here?" I quickly said, "Mom, he will definitely come to kill us. But he is afraid that others will see his face. The more people hear our cry for help, the safer we will be. The police will arrive soon. As long as we can delay it, we can survive." My mother was lying next to the door, and sure enough, the footsteps outside could not be heard. My mother's expression relaxed. Sure enough, I felt ecstatic in my heart. After confirming uneasily for a while, my mother almost collapsed on the ground, covering her heart with a trace of joy on her face. "Daughter, how come you, such a little kid, know everything?" But before my mother could finish her words, the next second she suddenly looked behind me and screamed in horror. I felt a heavy object hit my head hard. Along with a huge boom, I seemed to hear the sound of my skull breaking. There was only Scarlet in front of my eyes. He fell directly to the ground. I was foaming at the mouth in disbelief. I looked at the tall figure of the murderer, walking towards my mother with a hammer in hand. This is my first rebirth. I opened my eyes again and the lights came on. The man downstairs counted the floors and started walking toward my hallway. The lights went out. I was reborn again, and it was an infinite loop. The murderer heard our movements and changed his strategy. He climbed in from the balcony through the drain pipe. I gasped for air and turned to my mother and said, "Mom, he might also climb in from the balcony. Lock the sliding door." In order to make it easier to dry the quilts, many families here don't install anti-theft windows on the balcony. There is only a sliding door made of flowered glass from the balcony to the living room. My mother, who had just turned off the light, looked a little surprised. I turned on the light. We can't hide anymore, and venturing in the dark will only make it more difficult for us to set up defenses. It's better to just open it. My mom called my dad, but the call didn't go through. She locked the sliding door and called the police. This time she dragged the sofa to the sliding door. After she finished the arrangement, she called my dad again. "Mom, don't call my dad, it won't go through." I smashed the fragile items in my house onto the floor. "Mom, make some noise, shout for help, it's all right. The louder the better." The villain was afraid that others would see him, so he didn't dare to go up the stairs, so he climbed in from the balcony. Let's seize the opportunity to escape from this door. If we leave here, we will have a chance to survive. My mother was stunned for a second, but decided to listen to me and started smashing things and shouting. This time I didn't join her, I ran to the kitchen. I moved a stool and stood in front of the stove to light the fire, pouring all the oil in the bucket into the pot. But I overestimated my body. I was only an 8-year-old child and almost spilled the oil. But this also reminded me. I shouted, "Mom, come and help me." The blue flame began to burn. The temperature continued to rise. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding. As expected, the footsteps disappeared. Soon, a dark shadow like a ghost from hell appeared on the balcony. There was a loud bang. Bang. The first hammer mark appeared on the sliding door. My mother believes that the furniture at home will be used for many years, so she bought the most durable ones. So the balcony door was also made of tempered glass. It will not crack. It will slowly break apart after being hit hard many times. Even if it breaks, it will stick together to avoid hurting people. The hard glass delayed his time to break in. After several consecutive hits, the glass was completely shattered by his kick. At the moment when the man got into the house, I turned off the lights in the room. The room was instantly plunged into darkness, but he was backlit and couldn't see us, but we could see him clearly. The moment I turned off the light, my mother took the pot of boiling oil and poured it towards the balcony. The smell of burnt flesh instantly exploded in the air. The man howled terribly, holding his head, and rolled on the ground. I pushed the door open and quickly locked it from the outside. Then I grabbed my mother's hand and ran downstairs. Thump, thump, thump. Thump, thump, thump. The musty corridor was filled with the sound of my mother and I rushing down the stairs, our heavy breathing and the sound of our heartbeats like drums. When I was almost at the entrance of the staircase, I looked at the exit that I had spent half my life dreaming of taking my mother to escape, and I was so excited that I almost cried. But he didn't notice that a shadow suddenly stretched out his hand in the dark corner. The fish scraper in his hand stabbed directly into my mother's back from behind. My mother turned around in disbelief. The shadow pulled out the knife and stabbed wildly again. My mother screamed shrilly, and the sound activated lights in the entire corridor lit up one floor at a time. Finally, someone on the third floor couldn't help but open the door. With my mother's desperate scream, the door closed again. I jumped on the shadow like crazy and bit it hard. The shadow felt the pain and tried to stab me to death with the knife, but my mother held the handle tightly. I couldn't pull it out for a while. He gasped and slammed me to the ground. I felt my back snap into two. The shadow casually tore off a battery charging cable and strangled me to death in front of my dying mother. And I finally saw the shadow's face clearly. Whether it was my previous life or my rebirth, this was the first time I saw this face. Who is he? He looks very similar to the murderer but is much older. Half of his hair is gray. He looks to be over 50. No wonder the murderer in the previous life could escape so quickly and without a trace. Turned out that everyone was wrong. There was another person waiting for him that day. He was not alone. Before I took my last breath, I saw my mother's dropped cell phone light up. My brain was starved of oxygen and my consciousness was blurred. But I still heard a voice in there. But the pippi-la-log sound doesn't sound real. It was like the noise an old-fashioned radio made when the signal was bad. It sounded like someone was calling my mother and my name anxiously. Min. Nan. This is my second rebirth. When I opened my eyes again, the murderer downstairs counted the floors, picked up the axe and started walking towards my hallway. My brain was working rapidly. I felt like I was on fire. Who is that person? Who is that voice on the phone? My mother held me in her arms and said, "Don't be afraid, my daughter. I'm here." My mother's words finally brought me back to reality. There is no time. Get rid of the first murderer first. When my mother poured the boiling oil away like last time, I pulled her out of the door. I handed the kitchen knife I had hidden to my mother, and I held the fruit knife that was more suitable for my body. I tried my best to control the trembling in my voice. "Mom, there's another man hiding in the corner of the first floor. He's in the same group as the murderer just now." In the darkness, my mother's expression was subtle. "Daughter, how did you know that?" Instantly, she forced a smile and said, "It's okay, don't be afraid, daughter. Mom is here." She protected me behind her. My steps were no longer so brisk. At this moment, my mother's cell phone lit up. My mother's expression flashed with surprise. But when she answered it, there was only the sound of beep beep la la. Min. Nan. It's my dad. How could it be? I remember when the accident happened, my mother kept calling my father. But she never got through until she died. Later, I learned that my father had taken a long-distance order that day. He was a city taxi driver and usually did not take long-distance calls. But the customer added a lot of money, and my dad wanted to earn more money to buy a skirt for my mom and a cake for me, so he gritted his teeth and took the job. After seeing off the guests, he was too tired, so he sent a text message to my mother. Then he turned off the sound, pulled over on the way back and fell asleep in the car. Unexpectedly, something happened to my mom and me that night. When he woke up and called, the police were already on the line. Why did my dad get through now? My mom was almost crying on the phone. "Deshang, where are you?" But there was only a clicking sound on the other end of the phone. Shu. Min. Nan. Sure. Then the call was disconnected. My mother said to the phone, trying her best to suppress her tears, "Hello." I looked down at the dark staircase on the first floor. It was like looking into the abyss of hell. I knocked on the door on the third floor without caring. I knew there lived a young man who liked to stay up late playing online games. The last time I was reborn, the one who opened and closed the door was him. "Open the door. Open the door. Can you please let us in? Save us. Save us." But the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice. Just when I was determined to fight to the death, even if the worst that happened was that I would die again, I could hear the sound of fighting from far away downstairs. My mother quickly hugged me in her arms, and we both looked downstairs in confusion, but neither of us had the courage to go down. The voice-activated light turned on and off and on again. Soon followed by a few painful groans. Everything fell into dead silence. The sound-activated lights in the corridor seemed to be in eternal darkness. Darkness. Deathly darkness. My mother and I didn't say anything and just looked at each other. I went to pull her hand and found that she was shaking like a sieve. Just now when we faced the murderer upstairs. When the accident happened, she clung to the murderer's thighs tightly in order to give me a chance of survival, and was beaten into a pulp. She held the fish scraper tightly, preventing the man from pulling it out and stabbing me. I have never seen her look so frightened and timid. My mother and I were driven crazy by an unspoken sense of uneasiness and premonition. The sounds of the world seemed to stop. Until the sound of police cars' sirens broke everything. A group of uncles in uniform rushed to the corridor. Light is coming. My mother and I finally mustered up the courage to walk down the stairs. We finally saw the scene at the staircase. The floor was covered in blood. The shadowy villain, with holes all over his body, was dying, twitching and gasping for air. And the one lying in the pool of blood was motionless. It's my dad. His eyes were wide open and his thick black hair was soaked in red liquid. How so? My mother held on for a breath until my father was pushed out of the emergency room. He was declared dead due to his injuries. My mother finally fainted. Her spine collapsed overnight. One of the two murderers was in the intensive care unit and died within a few days. A person with 60% of his body covered in extremely severe burns is living a life worse than death and has to face legal sanctions. These two are father and son. His father drove a refrigerated truck and delivered fish to the market every day. The murderer who killed people downstairs of my house was my son. He was born a superhero. The woman who was killed was his biological mother. His father knew that his son had made a serious mistake, but not only did he not choose to call the police, he also chose to assist his son when he chose to kill and silence him. He originally planned to drive a refrigerated truck parked in the community and hide his son directly after his son killed the witness. This is also why the murderer was able to disappear on the spot before his rebirth, and the police were unable to find him for 10 years. But later I found that my mother and I had made it downstairs safely. Guessing that something had happened to my son, I decided to silence him. When he was in the ICU, the police asked him why he was an accomplice in the abuse. He cried and said, "I am his father, I can't watch him die. I can't help it, I can't help it. Then what about my father who will give him back to me?" The infinite loop stops. For 6 months I sat on the windowsill every night in the same position. I closed my eyes, prayed silently and opened my eyes. But the rebirth I longed for never came. I developed strong suicidal tendencies. But I kept saying, I want to be reborn. The psychiatrist diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder. I was advised to see a psychiatrist and be hospitalized. I tried to cut my wrists again and again but was saved again and again. During that half year my mother aged 10 years and her hair began to turn gray. I kept telling my mother that I had been reborn many times. I also said that before I was reborn my father was not dead. I wanted to save my mother. I also wanted to save my father. But I am so scared, afraid that I will really die if I am not reborn or activated. So what should my mother do if she suddenly loses my father and me? My father's death seems to have taken away her soul. My mother just hugged me and cried every time. Another day half a year later, when I gritted my teeth and determined to face everything, I would not let my mother worry anymore. But I found that my mother was sitting on the balcony absent-mindedly, with her legs outside, and she might fall off at any time. I was completely panicked. "Mom, why are you sitting there?" I shouted in panic, "Come down quickly, it's so dangerous there." But my mother turned back and smiled at me. The corners of her eyes were wet, and the pear dimples at the corners of her mouth were outlined. But he smiled happily for the first time in this year. My mom had her cell phone in her hand. The phone was in answering mode and it was my dad on the other side of the phone. It's still that peep peep la la sound. Min. Nan. My mother was showing me a treasure. "Daughter, look, your father is calling. He's looking for me. He didn't leave." I asked the telecommunications office and they said it was a signal failure. But I don't believe it. I know this is your father's voice, he is looking for me. A big crystal teardrop slid down my mother's face. She looked at me and said, "My daughter, I can no longer protect you. Mom, I really can't hold on any longer. Mom wants to find your dad." I collapsed and knelt on the ground. Once upon a time, I don't know how many sleepless nights. My dad also looked at my mom's photo and cried uncontrollably. He repeatedly called my mom, murmuring, "Shumin, can you hear me? My daughter and I miss you so much." But the voice wave on the other end of the line never responded to him. He hugged me tightly and his pale beard dug into my flesh. "My daughter, Daddy really can't hold on any longer. If I could, I would go back to the past to save your mother and you, even if it meant my own life." My mother turned her head and said, "Daughter, do you think there are miracles in this world?" Without waiting for my answer, she jumped down without hesitation. I crawled over like crazy, but it was too late. When I opened my eyes again, I was back to July 10, 2010. Before my mother was murdered. The murderer downstairs was swinging an axe and hitting a woman. I stepped back suddenly, shaking all over. I was reborn again. So that's how it is. The reason for my rebirth is not my death but my mother's. A pair of hands tightly covered my mouth from behind, and the breath from my mouth and nose sprayed heavily on my neck. Those hands are big and rough, they are not my mother's. I struggled with fear and made him. The man suddenly spoke in my ear. "Daughter, be quiet. It's me." I looked back in disbelief, suppressing the cry in my throat. Dad, why are you here?" My dad touched my head and said, "Daughter, it's great to see you standing up again." But I soon realized that something was wrong with my dad. Why was he wearing a hat at night? Also his face. My dad said, "I'm going to wake up your mom. If she turns on the light, it will be troublesome." My dad went to the master bedroom. I looked up at the clock and realized that my rebirth time was 1 minute earlier. My mom didn't turn on the lights. The murderer didn't notice me and my mother. "We're safe." I pushed the door open. My dad is hugging my mom. "Desheng, didn't you text me and tell me that you had a long-distance call and would be back late? How come you're back early?" My dad refused to let my mom go, his voice full of attachment. "Shumin, I miss you so much, I'm going crazy." My mother was a little embarrassed. "Why are you suddenly so cheesy? Our daughter is watching us." "No, why do you smell like cigarettes?" My mother reached out to turn on the light, but my father quickly stopped her. "Shumin, listen to me. There is a vicious murderer downstairs. If you turn on the lights and he finds any witnesses, he will kill them to silence them." My mother's expression immediately became serious. "What should we do?" "Let's call the police." My dad said, "Hey. After we call the police, we'll wait for them at home. Don't make any noise and don't turn on the lights. If we can survive these 10 minutes, we'll be safe." My mother nodded, "Okay." My mother lowered her voice and started calling the police. My father stood at the door holding a kitchen knife, looking out through the peephole. The time waiting for the police was so painful. At this moment, I suddenly saw that the lights of the neighbor's house across the street were on. The neighbors are an elderly couple of teachers. After retirement, they moved in with their son's 3-year-old twins. They are all kind old people who often help me with my homework. The twin boy and girl wore different clothes but looked exactly the same with big Barbie-like eyes. He giggles when he sees people. Soon the lights were quickly turned off again. Now from the perspective of an observer, I suddenly realized that this flash of light was in this dark night. Too obvious. The murderer stopped what he was doing, raised his head and looked in the direction of the neighbor's house. He began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. He grinned. 5. Oops. I broke out in a cold sweat, ran to the living room and whispered the situation to my dad. In the darkness, I couldn't see my father's expression. But you could vaguely see his back molars, which had already been bitten into shape. At this moment, I suddenly realized that something was wrong with my dad. A corner of his hair that was hidden in his hat was exposed. It was clearly white. My dad picked up my mom's cell phone and started making a call. "Hey, when will you be here?" "Okay, hurry up. Remember what I said, there is another person hiding in the corner of the stairs with a fish scraper in his hand. When you enter the community, the first thing you should do is stab the 4 wheels of the refrigerated truck parked at the north gate. Don't give these 2 people a chance to escape. Okay, be safe. If anything happens to them again, I will never let you go." There was a voice outside the door. My dad stuffed the phone into my arms. He looked at me deeply and said, "Take good care of your mother. After I leave, lock the door." My tears fell like beads from a broken string and I nodded. My mother anxiously tried to stop him. "Deshang, didn't you say there was a murderer outside? Why are you still going out?" My dad smiled and waved the kitchen knife. "It's okay, I'll hold it for a while, the police will be here soon." "You still don't trust me, your husband?" The light was still dim, but my mother finally noticed that something was wrong with my father. She was shocked and said, "Deshang, how come you suddenly look so old?" My mother was about to step forward to take a closer look at my father's face. I interrupted, pretending not to know, and grabbed my mother's clothes. "Mom, we're in the house. If we go out now, we'll just be a hindrance. We have to believe in Dad." My dad patted my head. The moment the door was closed, I opened my mother's phone. I had to verify something, which was also something my father wanted to tell me. I clicked on my dad's call record. The name displayed on the other end was Deshang. That was my dad's own name. As expected, he was talking to himself 10 years ago. 21. I locked the door as my dad told me. Looking through the peephole, my dad followed the murderer and kicked open the neighbor's door. From the other side came the terrified screams of the elderly neighbor couple, the heart-wrenching cries of two children, and the sound of fierce fighting. During the 10 years of riding a motorcycle and chasing the murderer for thousands of miles, avenging my mother and me with his own hands was the only belief that kept him alive. For this belief he has been exercising every day for 10 years. In his mind, there was always a vicious enemy who murdered his wife, fighting with him. Every move, every action, how to respond. In his fantasy, in his mind, in his sweat. He must kill this enemy who tortured and murdered his wife and ruined his daughter's life. The fighting outside was getting more and more intense. Roaring, screaming, banging, it was hard to tell who was who. My mother looked through the peephole with an anxious look on her face. She rubbed her hands back and forth. "What should I do? What should I do?" Suddenly, a hint of joy bounced out in her voice. "Ah, daughter, your daddy beat that guy down. How come your dad is so awesome? Oh no. Why is the door closed? I can't see." I cried and laughed at the same time. Of course, my dad is the most powerful person in the world. I heard my father's angry roar from the corridor. "Help, help. Someone is stealing children. Come and help me catch the human traffickers." My father shouted with great vigor, and my mother was stunned by his shouting. There was no way she could mistake my father's voice. "But isn't my dad across the street? Why does this sound like it's coming from downstairs?" "Daughter, did you see when your father came downstairs?" Sure enough, more and more lights in the community were lit up. I understood what my father meant, so I slapped the porcelain basin frantically and shouted at the top of my lungs towards the empty space on the balcony. "Catch the human traffickers. Uncle, aunt, grandpa, grandma, come and save me, there are human traffickers trying to snatch children." One family, two families, three families. Soon all the lights in the community came on. Downstairs, my dad was holding a shovel and fighting with the murderer's dad, the shadow hiding at the entrance of the corridor. Many neighbors opened their doors to help. I followed the sound and ran to the balcony. I saw that most of the people were wearing pajamas. Everyone had already gathered the panicked murderer's father and my father in a circle. Most of them were holding brooms, toilet brushes, spatulas, and stools. The man held a fish scraper in his hand, like a trapped animal, and kept trying to break through the crowd, but failed. In the crowd, I saw the online game boy on the third floor holding a keyboard as his weapon. Soon the sound of a police car whistled in. My mother cheered and opened the door and ran downstairs. I followed her closely, but I didn't go downstairs because I knew that the father downstairs was my father. But my father with white hair, the father from 10 years later, is still at my neighbor's house. 23. I pushed open my neighbor's door. The ground was covered with scarlet. The four neighbors who were hiding safely in the inner room looked at the living room through the crack in the door. The neighbors' grandparents trembled and covered the twins' eyes to prevent the children from seeing them. The murderer lay in a pool of blood, beaten beyond recognition. My father sat next to his body, covered in blood, smoking silently. He had taken off his hat, revealing a head of white hair. When he saw me coming, his face turned pale and he laughed. "Daughter, you are here. I think you already know that Dad has also been reborn." 24. My dad took a long drag on his cigarette. "Dad beat that bastard 20 times to avenge your mom." I cried and laughed. Dad, but weren't you asleep with your phone on silent at that time? Why can I get in touch with him this time? My dad laughed slyly. In this world, I am the only one who knows the exact location where he sleeps. So the first thing I did after I was reborn was to find a phone number to report him for drunk driving. I asked the police to wake him up for me. Now that he's here, it's time for me to leave. I couldn't help but burst into tears. The pain of losing my father gnawed at my heart. Dad, can you stay? At this time, cheers came from downstairs. My young father finally subdued the murderer's father. My father knew what I meant and he smiled. Look, with the help of that damned father downstairs, our revenge is finally complete. He touched my head, his fingers smelled of tobacco. His addiction to smoking started after my mother's accident. Dad is different from you. Dad is dead. I can't stay here. That day, someone on the internet gave me the exact clues of this bastard and I went there alone. Later, I found out that it was a trap set by that damn father and son, waiting for me to die. My father lifted the clothes off his belly. There were 6 black holes on it. That day your father died. But your dad also poked this bastard 6 times, so it was worth it. Later, I don't know why I came back here. I came back 17 times in total. I tried 17 times, but only this time I was able to rescue you and your daughter from their clutches without any harm. Dad can hug your mom again and see you stand up and walk well. Dad, I'm content. My dad took his last puff of cigarette and his body gradually became transparent. I burst into tears. I held on to my dad tightly. I wanted to feel his body temperature again. It was just like the body temperature I felt when he tied me to his back and rode with me for countless days and nights in those 10 years. But his body was getting colder and colder. My dad touched my head, but his fingers went through my body. I couldn't help but smile bitterly. He was a 7-foot-tall man, but his voice became choked. Dad is really gone this time. Daughter, forgive me. I will never ignore the phone again. Daughter, tell your mother that I miss her so much that I am going crazy. I collapsed and hunched over. Dad, can you please carry me on your back again? I beg you. Don't go, I beg you not to go. But no one responded to me, leaving me desperately grasping at the scattered shadows in the air, with a sad roar coming from my throat. Dad. I was seriously ill, and after I was discharged from the hospital, everything was back to square one. I am still the chubby little girl of 8 years old. I am not disabled. My parents are lovingly protecting me. The bad guys have been punished. My mother is as gentle and smiling as before. The old-looking, cigarette-smelling dad who was fighting desperately seemed more and more like an illusion the more she recalled it. My dad couldn't remember who was calling him and teaching him to save people. He was still happily driving the taxi. Whenever I pass by my mom's favorite dress store, I'll take a second look to see if there's any sale. Some cake shops offer half price after 8 o'clock. But his phone was never muted again. The grandparents of the neighbors next door couldn't remember how the murderer who broke into their house was hammered into a ball of mud. They said they were too old and confused. How Chao Xiong the murderer died has become an unexplained mystery. The white-haired man is like a drop of ink in the sea, disappearing without a trace. It seems that I am the only one in this world who can't forget my father whose hair turned white overnight. The memory of lying on his back and chasing the murderer for thousands of miles over the past 10 years. And every bit of him. But I knew that if I told him what people had forgotten about him, he will definitely touch my head. He said, "My daughter, this is better." 10 years later, the college entrance examination results came out, and I was admitted to a prestigious school with excellent scores. At that time, due to the epidemic, there were almost no people on the streets. I came back from school wearing a mask and was delayed very late. Walking alone on the street, I had no idea of the approaching danger. I was still immersed in the joy of being admitted to my ideal university. The only thing on my mind was the little worry of how to handle university classes during the epidemic. But the next second, a dark shadow covered his mouth and dragged him into the dark alley. He twisted my arm and put the knife to my neck. It dragged me further and further into endless despair. At this moment my phone screen lit up. There was a pippy-la-la sound coming from the other side. It's like the noise an old-fashioned radio makes when the signal is bad. Nan-thnen. Nan-thnen. The shadow kicked my phone to the ground. The screen is cracked. The sound stopped suddenly. In the distance, a tall and strong figure was walking against the light. A man with white hair had a lit cigarette in the corner of his mouth. He looked like a scarlet firefly in the darkness. He took a deep puff and roared furiously. "Let my daughter go, you bastard."